Fine. Okay. And as a first generation Canadian, I would like to start with land acknowledgement. So Smart Density is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. This treaty between the Anishinaabe Mississaugas and the Anishinaabe First Nation is an agreement to share and care for the Great Lakes region. Subsequent Indigenous nations, European and newcomers like myself have been invited to this treaty in the spirit of mutual cooperation. And we encourage each and every one of you to actually learn more about it. And that's why we put a link in the chat. It's a very useful link. And with that, I think it's a very interesting segment today because I was a panelist on a City Talk by the Canadian Urban Institute led by Mary. And I just enjoyed the way you led the webinar so much that I reached out and I invited you to have this webinar with me. And for the first time, I said, I actually want to interview you. And that would be a funny, an interesting to put you in that spot.
Sure.
And this is also the last webinar of the year. And I thought that we would do something special for that and with you, Mary. So thank you very much for coming here today.
Sure. Delighted to be here and delighted to have the tables turned.
Exactly.
We always say at City Talk that these sessions we do aren't the end of the conversation. They're just the beginning of a conversation. So we're all in one perpetual conversation. I mean, that's what a city is. A city is a tangible manifestation of a conversation, right?
And okay, I just want to have a short anecdote. I usually have like a 15-minute call with all the speakers that I bring to this webinar platform. And I had it with Mary. I think our lasted 120 seconds because Mary, you just have that casual, okay, let's talk about that. And let's talk about that. So here it is. Mary, let's start with that. Your last webinar was about 1,000 days of COVID. How was it? Tell us how.
Well, first of all, I think we just have to all just take a big breath and just take a moment to recognize what this 1,000 days has been and what we've all been collectively through, and all very different experiences, different sets of challenges, different kinds of things in terms of our internal lives and our external lives. And our external lives got constrained massively. But part of what we were trying to suggest was important about 1,000 days was to take that moment of sort of a kind of as an inflection point and say, okay, looking back 1,000 days, what have we really truly learned? And what are the things, there are things that we always say in City Talk, what's working, what's not, what's next. And I think part of where we feel we're at is to focus on the what's next now. What through that period, we tried a whole bunch of stuff. We had a whole bunch of things that were probably dysfunctional before the pandemic that then became exacerbated and so viscerally part of our lives that we can't ignore them anymore. And so what are the interventions now that maybe we experimented with and had permission to try because of the urgency? Now that you leave some of that urgency behind, how do you actually move forward systemically and say, here are the 6 key things that we now need to make general, that we need to introduce and now need to be completely made permanent. And we were trying to reflect on previous extraordinary shocks to urban life that have happened historically, and how, when you look back, you can say, oh, the cholera epidemic in London catalyzed the development of municipal wastewater treatment systems. And the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire catalyzed significant changes to the building code to make buildings safer and to provide proper egress. And the levee failures in New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast as a result of Hurricane Katrina catalyzed a kind of rethinking of what resilience planning needs to look like and what multiple lines of defense, multiple forms of defense need to look like, including nature-based solutions. So you can track all that now in retrospect. I'm saying, let's try to do that in advance. Let's try to say, okay, the next 1,000 days, here are the 6 or 8 key things. And at CUI, we're initiating an alliance of disparate voices on this, people from the private sector, the corporate sector, professionals, community activists, citizen groups, newcomer groups, Indigenous leaders, to talk about, and neighborhood, all focused on local, to talk about what are the key areas and key intervention points that would inform a new urban agenda for the next 1,000 days? And then what will that require of the government of Canada, the provincial governments, the local, regional governments, municipal governments, Indigenous governments, and then the rest of us who aren't in government that play other roles in civil society or in our professional practice?
And what do you think that would be? What do you think that change would be?
I think there's a whole bunch of them. We obviously there are going to be fundamental changes to downtowns. We're seeing that in real time. We're trying to get people ahead of that. It's hard because a lot of people, it's just human nature that we all want it to kind of go back to what it was. None of this is going back to what it was. We know that, you kind of instinctively know that, but what is that? Then how do you anticipate what it might be and what it should be? So we have an ongoing interest in downtowns and the future of downtowns. Downtown, cities are extraordinarily, as you know, Nama, they are extraordinarily resilient. When I was living in New Orleans after Katrina, people would say to me, oh, New Orleans should just be allowed to die. And I used to look at people and say, well, first of all, it takes a lot to kill a city. They're unbelievably resilient. People's attachment to their places is fierce. And there are all sorts of contributing factors that compel people to stay attached. But the other thing is that, cities are remarkably adaptive too, and they can overcome and respond to shocks in different kinds of ways. That's part of the health of a really well-functioning city, is that it's like an organism that can, reinvent itself. And so that's part of what I think's ahead. So downtowns, critical. Main streets, critical. Now we have a shift in terms of where people are spending their time. Some people are spending their time. Lots of people continue to have the routine they had. They continue to be in essential service, or they're in a job where they go to their work. But there are others that have different choices now. So what does that mean for main streets? What does it mean for main street businesses? What does it mean for newcomer neighborhoods? What does it mean for neighborhoods that are equity deserving, that haven't had the services that they now need because more people are there? So obviously, that's a second area of focus. The third thing I would say is that we have these multiple, somebody said poly-pandemic. We're in a poly-pandemic world where you've got other poly-crisis world where you've got other things pushing in, including a much more pressing awareness of the inequities that we have in terms of municipal service, municipal planning, so that vulnerable communities have not been getting the kinds of services and the kinds of supports that they require. So what does that look like? How do we need to plan neighborhoods differently? How do we need to resource them differently? So the equity agenda overlays all of this, as does the climate agenda. So we're now under extraordinary pressure. We're going to continue to feel it. We're going to see governments having to respond. And I always say that, climate action will be won or lost in cities where the bulk of the population exists. And the performance of buildings and the performance of transit are the two critical components in urban life that affect GHG emissions and affect our trajectory and whether we can actually adjust to the climate pressures we're in. So that means intensifying development. It means making transit much more flexible. We're right now in Canada, most of our transit systems are operating at suboptimally with reduced fare box revenues. It's not true everywhere. Edmonton's, for instance, has come back up, but there are others that really they don't have. And again, it's exposes to me a challenge that existed before the pandemic, where transit probably hasn't been sustainably funded prior to this. So much in Canada, so much reliance on the fare box, and that's not true around the world. So do we have to kind of, person up on that and say, you know what, we actually need a national program that's going to support transit. If we really believe in climate, if we really believe in equity, and we believe in the benefits of mobility and choice, then we may need a different kind of federal commitment to transit or a national commitment to transit, and different kinds of models to make transit systems sustainable and to grow them, not reduce them. So I would say downtowns, main streets, equity, transit. And then the other one that everyone's talking about, and you sort of wonder, well, if everyone's talking about it, will it get solved, is housing. And again, you can see how this was present before COVID and then got exacerbated because we saw diminishment of services to people who were vulnerable. And so a higher incidence of homelessness because the shelter system wasn't functioning. And again, this is something that existed before COVID, but now you really see it. And so you've got a kind of combined crisis of interventions not being supportive for the homeless population, and then the continuum of housing not being a pipeline along the continuum of housing failing. So not enough supportive housing, not enough housing that's affordable for young families, and now you've got this multiple whammy, and now you've got interest rates and labor supply and supply chain issues and labor challenges. So it's all kind of hitting us at the same time, but it's a combined. If you look at it, even in terms of the transit conversation, these are very similar conversations. Ultimately, what it boils down to is we need community level planning, and that starts at a community level, works into a municipality, into a region, so that you can start to address these challenges from the bottom up, from the ground up, and then have a kind of consensus amongst the region, often led by the largest municipality or in tandem with the others, to say, this is the kind of planning that we're doing. Here are the investments we need in these core areas. And then the provinces and the federal government come to be as partners in that process, but that it be led from the ground up. And I think that, for me, would be the most profound shift that we need to make post-COVID. We need to understand that it's all local, it's all place-based, and we need to start there, problem identification, challenge identification, working across horizontally with a bunch of partners, identifying what the priorities are, and then inviting the other orders of government to be part of that process to solve that. And it's not going to look the same across the country. It has common elements, but it's never the
same. No, that's exactly my question. The list of challenges that you're speaking to, and that is the unique angle that you, and I don't think there's any other like organization, professional urban organization, that bring that unique angle that CUI brings, which is like different cities across the country.
Right.
You're talking about this list of challenges. Can you speak to like East versus West, or specific like Halifax versus Calgary versus Toronto versus Vancouver? That I think is fascinating to hear your perspective, because during the pandemic, like you covered it all. So what? Right. Yeah.
Well, no one city is the same as another, and so you always want to say that right off the bat, that the topography, the cultural backgrounds, the whatever the natural asset mix has been that caused the city to form up in the first place, what the economy is based on in that city. So each of the cities you just illustrated have different histories and different kinds of backgrounds in terms of how the wealth was created that actually made the city happen, because cities form up around economies. So as a result, you always want local leadership that's attuned to this very particular assets that exist in each of those cities. And that's one of the dilemmas with any kind of national federal policy. And, you hear this phrase all the time now, but in the old days when I would use it and others would use it, not that many people said it, but now everybody says one size does not fit all. And I think that's good. We've got that through our thick heads that we know that's the case. But then you're in a situation where you say, well, yes, but as a country, we have an obligation around human rights. We have an obligation around the sort of national identity, or the shared identity that we have between English and French Canada and with Indigenous nations. And so what is that? What are the entitlements that are associated with that attachment and that history? So what I would say is that each of these cities, and part of what CUI is in the business of, I said when I took this job that we were in the connective tissue business. So part of what we're trying to do is Canada does vertical arrangements very well, from the federal government to the provincial government to regional or province or municipal governments. We don't do horizontal well at all. And we don't have, we're a vast geography with a small population. And we don't have the kind of dense collaborative networks that Europe has, or that the United States has, where you have many cities and many agglomerations of people who are constantly trading back and forth. You and I have talked about this a bit before. If you talk to people in Canadian environments who work in city building, almost all of them will tell you that they've made their career in one city, and they may have made their career in one sector. They may have worked for the government, or they may have worked for private sector or community. In the United States, people have worked in many cities. They move between the industry, between government, between the civil society and not-for-profits. There's a lot more mobility because there's a lot more people, and it's a lot denser. So I've said we're in the connective tissue business, and we're going to try to create platforms where we can learn from each other. So Vancouver starts doing modular housing before anybody else does. And then other cities learn about that and then get a chance to go to Vancouver to look at modular housing. There are examples like that. In Quebec, in Montreal, they have a very robust approach to the social economy. So they have a much broader understanding of economic development. And again, other folks and practitioners in other cities can go to Montreal and can see what that looks like. In Halifax, again, a marine-based economy with a harbor that's invested an enormous amount in the redevelopment of their waterfront, not only for visitors, but also for the local economy. And they've generated all sorts of economic benefit from that by doing what is called placemaking. So lots of people come from around the country to go look at the placemaking that was formed in Halifax. And now Halifax is in a situation, also it's a regional municipality with an enormous geography and lots of rural spaces inside that municipality, as has Ottawa. The city of Ottawa also large geography, and the city of Ottawa is challenged by a predominantly public sector workforce that's not actually coming back into the office as much. So what do you do with the retail there? So yes, you can hear as I'm sort of stitching this narrative together, each of these cities has a set of unique assets, and what I always am advocating for is how do you get them more autonomy, more resources to try stuff. So a good example would be the city of Calgary, that's had an exodus of office workers 10 years ago, and it has been adjusting to what is the future of our downtown when pre-COVID they had 400 empty office floors. So they've had a jump start in imagining, wow, the use of our central business district is going to have to change. So they are now absolutely at the front of the pack on that. And the municipal government has engaged with investment, and they're working with private sector partners and all sorts of, and the federal government has said, oh, jeepers, I guess we better put some resources into thinking about how do we help office space and commercial space converge. And we're working with a number of partners, including Canada Mortgage and Housing, on what are the potential for converting commercial into residential. All these changes, whether it's waterfronts or commercial space or streets or parks or public space, and these are all part of the equation, and each city is going to have its own set of priorities and its own set of challenges. And you look at libraries, for instance. Halifax, Calgary, Edmonton have made significant investments in, as you know, you're a designer, so stunning public spaces. And along with those new library spaces is a range of programming that typical Canadians don't understand what a library is. A library is something from their childhood, and they have a particular notion of what it once was. That's not what it is now. So the idea that each of these places reinvents itself and uses streets, which to me is the sort of circulatory system of a city, and the downtown, which is the heart of the city, and you start to stitch together what that uniqueness is going to look like. And that benefits you in terms of continuing to grow your economy and the opportunities that your economy will provide for your people that live there. But it's also about attracting visitors and tourists in a different kind of way. So it's a pretty rich time. This is a pretty robust landscape for people to roll up their sleeves and say, how can I engage? How can I contribute? And for us each to figure out, how do we actually get our neighbors, and particularly our neighbors that don't look like us, engaged with us in these conversations? How do we enable conversations to happen in neighborhoods for them to have their own conversations and figure out what it is they want? It's all about self-determination. That's really what cities are about, enabling self-organization. And I just keep hoping our governance is going to be able to be flexible enough to create those enabling conditions so that we can see the magic that can happen when people are able to realize their aspirations in their place.
I don't even know where to start. I have like 30 questions. Okay, so I love the definition that we do vertically very well and we do horizontally very badly. I think that's so accurate. Question number one is like, what would you say for what do you wish to see? So from people like myself who, run businesses in this country and practice and design and talk about cities with passion, how can we integrate? Because you're right, I went to Vancouver when I wanted to learn more about the missing middle, laneway housing, things like that. That's it. It was an educational tour, but nothing really beyond that.
Right.
What do you wish you will start happening? What do you wish to see? And if you kind of had like this magic wand to correct things within the government or within even the private sector, what do you think could have the greatest impact?
You know, I've been so resistant to be any kind of a prognosticator, and boy, oh boy, COVID just became this perfect opportunity for urban pundits, you know, and I had journalists asking for, you know, quick sound bites and what do you think? Is this the end of the city and all that kind of stuff? And I was so, I reacted quite negatively to that idea because I don't think we actually know. And so I don't know if I want to have a magic wand, to tell you the truth, because I think that part of what the magic of cities is that nobody's the boss of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to be predictive, you know, and that's why people often think I'm a planner, and which I'm not trained as a planner. And I always say, well, I'm actually probably more of an anti-planner, you know, because I think that planning and rules can actually constrain creativity. And that it's interesting, you know, when you go to neighborhoods, if you go to different urban neighborhoods now across the city, across the country, into different little pockets, and you and I could be walking with somebody, and what I would see is, you know, really interesting fine grain urbanism with, oh, you can see when the height limit changed and they went here, or you can see where they've tried that, or they've sandwiched that and they had some adaptive reuse. So look at that old building crunched next to the new one. I think that's really dynamic and interesting. There are other people that want it all to look uniform and tidy. And I feel like tidy is the sort of, you know, that phrase, perfect is the enemy of the good. And I would say tidy is the enemy of the joyful. And so much of what makes a city so interesting is when you see things that aren't predictable, and they surprise you. You go around a corner and you think, oh my God, look at that. So I guess what I would like to see, and what I think happened through COVID, we put up a whole site about it called citysharecanada.ca, and we're working with the government of Canada to incentivize other kinds of fund other kinds of projects. Are these really granular interventions where not-for-profits or business improvement areas or charitable groups or local government come up with some really interesting idea for a local park or a local lot or something, and how effective that can be. So I guess I would like to see many, many more examples of resourcefulness and imagination. And I will say, to challenge you and your colleagues now, you know, I worked in 2 cities prior to coming back to Canada. I worked in New Orleans and New York, and these are both cities where the design community was absolutely at every table. And designers weren't seen as some, you know, remote profession that was to be brought in late. They were at the table from the outset, and they were there and artists and designers, and they were there to contribute to problem solving. They were there to contribute to opportunities. They were there to participate in the whole thing. And I found, certainly in New York, you could rally that community really quickly, and they would get engaged because they had a sense that the city was theirs, and the city had a sense that everybody in the city had a sense that they wanted that constituency present. I find here in Canada, it's harder, and I don't know what that's about. I don't know if it's that the design professions have been relegated in a certain way to a certain role, or whether you're just all a little timid, or whether you just need people like me to say, come on, like, get your sleeves rolled up and engage. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, one of the interesting things, of course, is that this needs to be done in ways that empower communities. And I think an enlightened designer and planner knows that they're not the expert. They're not coming in to tell anybody anything. They're coming into a process to support and provide technical expertise and background to enable communities to realize what they want. So that would be what I'd love to see that. And I'd love to see this at the neighborhood level. I'd love to see more engagement of art, culture, design, entrepreneurs, newcomers, business associations, because this is main streets are the gateway drug into the economy. Like they're the way that you get into the larger supply chain, and who knows where it goes from there. And it doesn't have to go anywhere. It can just be a viable business that supports you and your family. And you have a couple of, you have other ways to support people around you, and you have housing above you or next to you or whatever it is. So I'd like to see that. I'd love to see a strengthening of our economic development coming from the communities and making better use of the assets that are on those main streets, like libraries and faith institutions and Legion halls and whatever it is in your community. We all know what they are. We all know where there's untapped potential to create sort of engagement spaces on main streets and in our downtowns. And they're both going to morph. And that's a really essential conversation for us all to be engaged in.
You said something very interesting about planners, and it actually leads me to one of the questions from the audience that I will address in a moment. But what happened, when I became like planner in Canada, and it's a very North American invention, by the way, because in Europe, when you say urban planner, is like something completely different. We learned about how the importance of speaking to those who don't have can make their voice heard around the table right now. And oftentimes you just, I'm telling you this with all the frustration that I have dealing with communities that only see their current needs, and I get it. I'm not even sure like what the question is, just, I'm trying to share my frustration with you. But I do have a question from the audience, okay, too, actually. But Toronto waterfront, the mayor's proposal to re-examine density on the waterfront. What point does density become unsafe, and where do we find that information? And I was on an interview on the radio the other day and the host was saying, Toronto has a density problem. And I was like, Toronto does not have a density problem. On the contrary, we're not dense enough. Like, look at our city. So what do you have to say about this misconception of density, and density is unsafe? Or, what give me the tools as a professional to speak to communities about it, because I'm so frustrated, Mary. Yes, sorry for using your question.
No, it's fine. And I'm sorry that I have a dog who, only wants attention when I'm on a webinar, of course. And so she's determined to be noisy. So I'm sorry if you're getting that noise now about her and her squeaky toy. I'm trying to get it away from her.
No, I didn't hear her.
Okay, good. So first of all, let me just say that there is a very deep-seated trope that cities are bad, that if you put people together, it's a risk. I have a slide that I show in some of my talks where I show how we've turned this, it's centuries old, and it's rooted in all sorts of religious tradition and various things where we've demonized, the sin of the city. So this notion of density and being fearful is hardwired into lots of people. So I'm just saying it's a cultural trope that is I think we probably can culturally, which we can probably culturally narrow down. And I think it has to be resisted at all costs because it's really fundamentally a kind of misanthropic anti-people thing. And so what I would say is this: bad density is not what we want. And what bad density is overcrowding, inadequate amenities, lack of services in the proximity, and really bad neighborhood planning without public realm investments. And we all know parts of our cities that have this. And we know that towers in the park, which was the predominant approach that planners sadly advocated and that public housing authorities did, meant that you created these isolated islands with parking lots around them and no other activity. So people are actually the answer, folks. People that are saying density is a problem, let's change that to people are not the problem. The problem is not using space in ways that encourage multiple kinds of activities and multiple uses. So 24/7 activities that are flexible, lots and lots of choices. Jane Jacobs has it in Death and Life. Just go back and read Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's worth reading every year. And it reminds us what the ingredients are that builds in community safety. And diversity is a huge component of that. So you have services, you have living spaces, you have working spaces, you have servicing spaces, you have public spaces, you have recreational spaces. Those are the neighborhoods that really have all the ingredients for us to not be fearful of. And I also think, and I just want to say this to your audience, we have to just try to suspend our judgment here because, lots of people are quite happy living on the 50th floor. And I worry that certain kinds of urbanists want to be judgmental of that and say, oh, no, we don't, that's bad. Some people like that. That's the choice they're making. And we also, I think it's also so much part of cities is about choices. And one of the failures we've got at the moment is that the system is not providing a range of choice in housing along a big continuum, multifamily, ground level, affordable family in apartments, fourplexes, all that kind of stuff. So whatever we can do, I'm back to, if you said to me, what's my magic wand dream? My magic wand dream is that communities find their way to determine what their priorities are. The dilemma here, and I know what you're saying about your frustration, is that there is a knee-jerk tendency in neighborhoods to not want any change at all. And that's, you kind of can't have it both ways, right? So I think we've got to allow ourselves permission to let our neighborhoods change in ways, and for us to engage in how they're going to change and what the amenity mix needs to look like, and that we're building complete neighborhoods. And we're continuing to make our neighborhoods, if you're in an old neighborhood, more complete. And more complete may mean more newcomers, more people that aren't necessarily just like you, living the same kind of life that you lead,
Mary, we try to keep our webinars to 30 minutes long so people could fit it within their days. It's 11:31. Anything, I don't know, last thing before we wrap up and wish everyone happy holidays? Anything else you would like to add?
I'm sorry that I haven't been looking at the questions, and so I'm not able to respond.
I know, but by the way,
yeah. So I'm just looking at this comment here about developers. So here's what I would say. I think that we've had a moment in 1,000 days where we were all given permission by virtue of necessity and urgency to be more of a DIY city. So we needed mutual aid groups, we needed Facebook groups, we needed those librarians taking their routers to the windows so that people who had depended on them for Wi-Fi access could stand outside. We needed those laneways and parks and we needed parks to provide a shelter in temporary ways and what are called encampments. There are all sorts of things that we've observed in the last 1,000 days that are really instructive clues for what might be the great neighborhoods and cities for the future. And so I would encourage all of us to look out our own windows, pay attention as you walk the streets, wherever it is you're going, and think carefully about what are you noticing that can be instructive in terms of what we fundamentally need when we're in a crisis. And then how do we start to anticipate, how do we actually, bike lanes, all that kind of stuff, patios, but also opening up stairwells in high-rise buildings so that people can actually network floor to floor, all that kind of stuff. There's a gazillion examples of this, and I would encourage us all to be really reflective about that and start to put in place whatever the necessary enabling conditions are, that we don't lose that nimbleness, that we actually cultivate more and more of that so that we can engage and be attuned to what the city wants to be next.
You had some really, really beautiful quotes. Thank you very much, Mary. That was our last webinar for 2022. Oh, Mary, I wanted to ask you about webinars. No, I have to ask you. Mary, what do you plan for 2023? What is CUI big plans?
I think we've got to move now to, we've got to move from learning and reflecting. I mean, we never want to learn, you never want to leave reflecting, but to now, what are the tangible actions we need? And what would a new urban agenda look like? What does that mean? So I have some gut instincts on this, but I think what I need to continue to talk with people about is marshaling the kind of public consensus we need, that Canada needs to organize itself from the perspective of problem solving and community solutions coming from the ground up. And that's true whether you're in a large city, a small neighborhood, an urban environment, or a rural environment. It all starts with the community and with the economy that supports that. So I think 2023 is our year and 2024, 2 years, for us to start to create whatever we can to elevate, try stuff, continue to take things to the next stage in terms of really proving proof of concept, and then start to see how we make that, make it proliferate more quickly so that we're all able to seize on the opportunity. And I think it's a rich moment here, even though it's going to be probably fiscally, we're going to face all sorts of challenges. The old story. I mean, often fiscal constraints can generate all sorts of great, really smart, resourceful innovation. So let's roll up our sleeves, folks. It ain't over. As I always say, it's not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. Thank you for having me.